Imagine that you can upgrade a 1-cost champion, and that would not only allow you to fast 8 or maybe fast 9, but you could also just use it as your main carry to straight up top 4 in a lobby. You heard me right, I'm not talking about 3-starring a 1-cost, just a unit that you spent 3 gold on in the early game to get you some consistent elo back in the day. Meet Set 5 Forgotten Vayne, one of the most memorable champions in TFT for those who played back then, and a champion that, in my opinion, was the main cause of an item to be completely reworked in the following set.
Time for reckoning.
One of the most fascinating things about Forgotten Vayne in Set 5 is that she was essentially a reprint of Set 4's Dusk Vayne. Yet one of these was one of the more forgettable champions in her set, while the other became one of the most infamous almost overnight. Both of these units shared the same ability called Silver Bolts, which was a passive that made it so basic attacks applied a stack of silver. The third stack would then consume them all to deal true damage on the target. This true damage scaled with their AP. Admittedly, in Set 5 the damage numbers on her ability were a bit higher, but at the cost of having slower base attack speed and slightly lower base AD than the Set 4 version. But in my opinion, these changes are not the reason that this champion was so wildly different. Although the tuning on these numbers definitely mattered for her strength on any individual patch, the real reason that Vayne took over in the early days of Set 5 was that she abused pretty much every mechanic available to her at the time. The first mechanics that were available to her were obviously her traits. The easiest trait to look at is the Ranger trait. Ranger gave Vayne a burst of attack speed, 75% at that. Rangers would get this bonus after 4 seconds, it would then last for 4 seconds and then refresh again every 4 seconds after. Her other trait was called Forgotten, which gave her AD and AP, which increased with the amount of shadow items that her team had. We'll get to shadow items in a second. These bonuses in AD and AP were definitely meaningful as it allowed Vayne to scale up the amount of true damage she was doing. So you can probably already guess how this is setting up to make for a powerful unit. Her passive deals a lot of true damage, which we all know can already be problematic. Her ability essentially scaled with attack speed and AP, as she had no mana cost. The only way for her to proc this ability was to auto a champion 3 times. Well, one of her traits gave her a giant burst of attack speed while the other gave her AP. But even with these two in mind, the unit did not appear to be that strong right off the bat. Just like the previous version in Set 4, she was seen as a kind of mediocre item holder in the early game and a trait bot, but the build that allowed her to take over fights was not figured out until a bit later into the patch. So let's talk about shadow items, one of the major set mechanics of Set 5. The idea of shadow items to me was actually pretty interesting, although surely this ended up being way too difficult to balance and have abuse cases like Vayne and LeBlanc.
What the hell is this?
The idea was that a shadow item would offer a massive bonus to how an item would typically function, but would come at a great cost or restriction alongside of it. Kind of like a double-edged sword, if you will. Something like Shadow Warmogs, officially named Warmog's Sacrificial Armor, gave a massive amount of health, but at the cost of the holder losing health every second. But the two important shadow items that we are interested in for Vayne were Shadow Jeweled Gauntlet and Shadow Zeke's Herald. Shadow Jewel Gauntlet, named Sacrificial Gauntlet, just like a normal Jewel Gauntlet, allowed the user's spells to crit, but gave the user a massive amount of critical strike damage. The drawback at the time was that the user would take 15% of their maximum health as self-inflicted damage every time they cast their ability. Well, as you may remember, Vayne was never casting an ability. She simply had a passive that would proc every time she autoed a champion 3 times. So not only could her true damage now crit, the crit damage was increased massively, and she would take 0 drawback from the item, as she was technically never casting an ability. This was quickly changed once Vayne got traction. The stats of the item were heavily nerfed, but they would immediately get buffed back if the user casted an ability, and this buff would apply to the first spell that procced it. Although this is kind of a funny roundabout way to change the item, it was actually quite successful in not nerfing the champions who really liked the item, while making sure champions like Vayne could not abuse it. As a little side note, imagine a champion with a very low mana cost like Karma or Ahri in the current set taking 15% of their life whenever they cast it. They would quite literally knock themselves out within the first half of a fight, which is exactly what Set 5 Karma was doing, until they changed the amount of self-inflicted damage to scale with the amount of mana your spell costed. I don't know why, but I have a funny memory of people having a Shadow JG on their Karma, and maybe they didn't know how it worked, or maybe they just low rolled and had no other option but to build a shadow item because of their components. Okay, anyway, so because of her traits and Shadow Jewel Gauntlet, Vayne's true damage is doing quite a bit of damage, but if she couldn't proc this passive fast enough, surely she just would not keep up with the DPS of higher cost units. Her Ranger trait was great for this, but it had a 4-second delay and went on and off. One simple fix for this was to simply build a Gwynsu's, which was a great option, but there was an even better one. Enter Shadow Zeke's Herald, also known as Zeke's Bleak Herald. Before becoming a support item, Zeke's was actually a craftable item in TFT made up of a sword and a belt. So as with every craftable item in Set 5, if you used a shadow component, you could build the shadow version of the item. Vayne could not simply ignore the drawback of Shadow Zeeks, but to be honest, she could not care less that it existed, as many of the units in her comp were just trait bots. The way Shadow Zeeks worked is that it would steal 20 to 25% based on the patch, the attack speed to the units left and right of the holder. The holder would then gain 40% attack speed for each person it stole from. So if you would put 2 trait bots beside Vayne, sure, they would lose some attack speed, but then Vayne would start the fight with 80% attack speed up front. And that is the equivalent to one item giving more attack speed than 2 red buffs on the current patch of TFT. It obviously was not that easy to get multiple best-in-slot shadow items in a game, so Vayne rarely had both of these items, but simply having one and then an alternative like a normal Jewel Gauntlet or a Gwynsu's for the other one was more than enough, but having both was pretty insane. It's also worth mentioning that Zeeks was a craftable item like we mentioned earlier. You could also just build Zeeks for units beside Vayne as well to give her more attack speed. These were much easier to come by as they weren't support items yet. Okay, so surely we're done here, right? She's dealing true damage every 3rd auto. The true damage itself is scaling up with her trait and Shadow Jewel Gauntlet, and she's applying it at rapid speeds because of her traits and Shadow Zeeks, right? This one cost is already pumping out so much damage and killing the frontline units she's targeting way too fast for a one cost, right? Well, yeah, but there's actually more. Runon's Hurricane. Now, this is an item that still exists in TFT to this day, but it was reworked in set 6 right after we said goodbye to Forgotten Vayne. I'm a believer that she was one of the major reasons behind this rework, but it was a great choice to rework as there would be many more abuse cases in the future had it stayed, like the current Jinx or maybe even Callista. This one is an easy explanation. Runon's Hurricane would fire an extra bolt doing reduced AD, kind of like it does now, but it would apply on-hit effects back then. And as far as I could remember, the on-hit effect actually was not reduced, so I'm sure you already know where this leads. Not only is the true damage on Silver Bolts getting high and she's applying it incredibly fast, but now she's applying it to multiple units. Funny enough, building a Shadow Hurricane would actually nerf Vayne quite a bit. Shadow Hurricane had better stats and fired 2 bolts instead of 1, at the cost of making it so the bolts no longer applied on-hit effects, which would go against the whole reason Vayne was so incredibly strong in the first place.
But we're also, as of today, starting to see Vayne 2 do really well with 6 Forgotten, to a point where we're not really comfortable with a 1-cost 2-star doing this well. So we're also nerfing the true damage that Vayne gets at 1 and 2-star, pretty big.
So obviously Vayne herself got nerfed, as well as some of these items and traits around her, but I thought this was a super interesting story of how so many things went right for a 1-cost unit, even if that 1-cost was essentially a reprint of the same unit from just one set prior. I'm not sure if this Vayne was the best 1-cost carry ever, as her strength was figured out quite late into the first patch of the set and she was nerfed extremely quickly afterwards, so who knows how strong she could have actually been if everything about her was optimized. I've heard rumors of the dreaded patch 10.J4 being the best 1-cost ever, but unfortunately that was before my time in TFT, but I would love to look into it. If you enjoyed this dive into some of TFT's history, I would really appreciate a like, comment, subscription, as this video took quite a while to make and I had to research quite a bit to make sure I remembered everything correctly. Let me know if there are any other infamous units that you remember and you'd like to see similar videos on. TFT is a beautiful game and it's so interesting how much a unit can be affected by the things around them. So I'd love to take more looks into some of the outliers in the TFT history. Stay beautiful, my friends. I'll see you in the next video.